The lights were on. The stage was set. The time was 8 p.m. sharp, and millions were watching. Barack Obama was seated across from one of America's most provocative television hosts, Jonathan Pryce. Known for his sharp tongue and unforgiving interviews, Pryce didn't invite guests to talk, he invited them to bleed. Tonight was supposed to be another high-profile ambush. But his guest wasn't just a politician. He was the former President of the United States. And he had come without a script. As the cameras rolled and the countdown ended, the host smiled, but his eyes told a different story. "Mr. President," he began, "tonight we won't be discussing policy. We'll be discussing responsibility. Are you ready to be honest?" Obama's face didn't move. No twitch. No raised eyebrow. Just a calm, measured breath. "Jonathan," he said quietly, "the only way to face the truth is to stop performing it." The room shifted. You couldn't hear it, but you could feel it. A studio designed for spectacle had just been handed something else entirely: presence. The host pressed forward. "Your administration deported more immigrants than any before. You launched more drone strikes than Bush. You expanded surveillance. And yet, you left office with one of the highest approval ratings in modern history. Do you think you deserved it?" Obama leaned back, then forward, slowly. "That depends," he replied, "on what you think leadership is. A performance? A checklist? Or maybe just showing up on the hardest days and not turning away?" There was no applause sign, but silence had never said so much. In that moment, the studio became more than a studio. It became a mirror. And as the questions continued, questions about race, power, silence, and war, Obama answered not with defenses, but with stories. Not with rehearsed lines, but with remembered names. No one saw it coming. Not the host. Not the producers. Not the millions watching. Because somewhere between the third and fourth question, the interview stopped being an interview. It became a reckoning. And in the hours to follow, it would not be the answers that trended. It would be the silence between them. Movie camera. The studio lights were calm, too calm. Beneath the haze of cameras and cables, everything looked under control. The set designers had done their job. The floor gleamed. The host's desk was lit from below. The screens behind displayed the stars and stripes in a modern, minimalist tone. But no set could prepare for what was about to unfold. Barack Obama entered the studio with his usual composure, the same posture that once walked down the hallways of the West Wing. But this time he wasn't here as president. He wasn't here as a candidate, or a statesman. He was just Barack. And that made all the difference. Across from him sat Jonathan Maris, a sharp-tongued political commentator known for treating interviews like cross-examinations. He had a reputation: no fluff, no mercy. And tonight, he was aiming for legacy. They greeted each other with civility. Handshakes, pleasantries. The kind that disguise both intent and tension. But the moment the cameras turned on, the gloves quietly came off. "Mr. Obama," Jonathan began, "thank you for being here. I know this isn't your usual arena these days." Obama nodded, smiling slightly. "It's always worth talking. Especially when the noise gets louder." "That's what we're hoping for tonight," the host replied. "Let's turn down the noise and raise the stakes." And then it came. The question. The kind of question that doesn't wait for midpoints or segues. It arrives like a flashbang in a dark room. You've been called a symbol of hope, a transformative figure. But tonight I want to ask, do you ever wonder, if the world hoped too much from a man who couldn't change it all? There it was. Not a policy question. Not a critique of a single action or decision. But a doubt aimed at the soul. At the essence of who he was, what he represented, and whether he failed to meet the weight of that symbol. The studio was silent. Obama didn't flinch. He looked at the interviewer, then down, then away from the cameras. He exhaled quietly, the kind of breath that carries entire libraries of regret, restraint, and reflection. "I think about that more often than you'd believe," he said. A beat. When you carry a country's hope on your shoulders, you learn two things very quickly. First, no one can carry it all. And second, that's never an excuse not to try. The answer was soft. But the truth beneath it hit harder than any headline ever had. Jonathan, sensing the shift, leaned in. But was trying enough? Obama didn't answer immediately. His hand moved slightly, almost instinctively, like he was drawing on something he couldn't touch. "There are nights," he said finally, "when I remember a letter. Written by a mother who lost her son in a war that began before I ever took office. She thanked me. Not for ending it, because I couldn't in time, but for writing her back. For telling her that her grief mattered." He paused. "And then I think, no, trying wasn't enough. But silence wouldn't have been either." The host's face softened. He hadn't expected that. He was preparing for data, rhetoric, perhaps even a counterattack. Not a confession. "But then," Obama continued, voice steady, "there are other nights. Nights when I sit alone, and I ask myself, was I just a chapter, or did I leave something behind that rewrote the book?" Jonathan blinked. "And what do you think the answer is?" "I don't get to answer that," Obama said. "The people do. History does. And sometimes, children who weren't even born when I took office." The camera zoomed slightly. The image on screen showed a man not defending his past, but unraveling it piece by piece, not for approval, but for understanding. Jonathan sat back. "This wasn't the direction I thought we'd go tonight," he admitted. "That makes two of us," Obama replied. The tension had changed shape. It was no longer a battlefield, but something more vulnerable. A space where neither man had control. And for a moment, it didn't feel like television. It felt like a living room, a hallway, a long walk in the dark, where two people talk not to win, but to find their way. Jonathan looked at his notes. They felt useless now. He closed the notebook slowly and asked, "Then let me try again." Obama nodded. "What's the one thing," Jonathan said, "that still wakes you up at night?" The answer came without hesitation. "Whether I listened enough," Obama whispered. "Not just to advisors. But to silence. To people who didn't write letters. To stories that never reached me. That's what stays with me. Not the speeches. The silences." And in that moment, the lights, the camera, the broadcast, none of it mattered. What mattered was this: a leader not defending himself, but admitting what still haunts him. That night, people didn't watch a president. They watched a man look back, not to justify, but to wonder. And sometimes, that's the only honest thing left. Movie camera. Sometimes the loudest words are the ones never said. The following morning, the nation woke up not to a controversy, not to a scandal, but to something they couldn't quite explain. The headlines didn't know how to write it. There were no gaffes, no applause lines, no thunderous declarations. Just a moment between two men, one asking, the other answering with the kind of honesty that doesn't trend, but stays. Clips from the interview had gone viral overnight. Not the attacks. Not the statistics. But one particular answer, when Obama said he still wonders whether he listened enough. That clip wasn't shared because it was powerful. It was shared because it was silent. There were 6 seconds after those words where no one spoke. No interruption. No camera switch. No transition music. Just a silence that stretched, and somehow said more than any soundbite. At 7:43 a.m., a mother in Georgia tweeted, "I've never seen a politician pause after an answer and let it hurt like that." That's not politics. That's being human. By noon, pastors were quoting it in churches. Mental health advocates were writing essays about how silence is often the true measure of reflection. And in high school civics classes across the country, teachers stopped their lessons to play that exact clip. The silence had become the message. But there was more to that silence than what the public saw. Behind the scenes, inside the studio, in the seconds after the broadcast ended, something rare had happened. Obama had asked to sit alone for a moment. The crew cleared the set. Jonathan Maris, still visibly moved, gave him a brief nod and stepped out without a word. The cameras stopped rolling, but one backup security feed kept recording, an angle used only for archiving emergency footage. It captured a moment never intended for the public. Obama, seated alone at the center of the stage, took off his microphone, leaned forward, and put his hands together. Not in prayer. Not in defeat. But in stillness. For almost 3 minutes, he didn't move. In the control room, the producers watched with quiet awe. No one spoke. No one interrupted. One whispered, "I think we just saw the first moment of real reflection from a president, in real time." That recording was never aired, but its existence became legend within the station. "He didn't look like a man protecting his legacy," one lighting technician later said. "He looked like someone carrying something too heavy to name." What was it that weighed so heavily? Maybe it was the face of every parent who ever wrote a letter to the White House hoping for a miracle. Maybe it was the pain of Trayvon Martin, of Sandy Hook, of Charleston, of Flint, moments when the country expected a savior but got a man bound by the limits of democracy. Maybe it was knowing that being the first came with a million expectations, and he could only fulfill half. Or maybe it was something simpler, the realization that he still cared. Despite the years, the scars, the cynicism. Later that day, a member of the studio team found a folded piece of paper left behind on the interview desk. It was a printout of a poem. Not by Maya Angelou or Langston Hughes, as many would expect. But by an unknown young poet named Aleya Benton, 17 years old, from South Chicago. It read. "He carried hope in a box made of mirrors. Each time he looked, he saw who they wanted him to be. But the one who saved me was the man who didn't speak. He just stayed. No one knew how it got there." Obama hadn't read from it during the interview. But someone on his team later confirmed, it was a letter she had sent 3 years earlier. One he had kept in his study. One he never responded to, until now. The silence wasn't empty. It was the sound of something finally being heard. Back on air that evening, Jonathan Maris opened his show with an unplanned monologue. For the first time in his career, he ditched the opening script. "I asked a question last night I thought would corner a man," he said. "Instead, I met a silence that humbled me." That sentence was quoted in newsrooms and boardrooms alike. In an age of rapid-fire reactions and strategic outrage, a political moment had broken the rules, by breaking the silence. But not everyone was pleased. Several pundits criticized the interview for being too soft. Where was the accountability, they asked. Why wasn't he pressed harder, others tweeted. But the public wasn't asking for answers. They were reliving a feeling. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, a leader who doesn't shout, who doesn't deflect, could still exist. Not perfect. Not omnipotent. But present. Listening. Aware. By the third day, the ripple effects were undeniable. One veteran journalist put it bluntly, the president didn't defend his record. He shared his doubt. And for once, America didn't punish him for it. It thanked him. The silence had spoken first. And people had listened. Movie camera, you never forget the voice that speaks after silence, especially when it's not raised, but revealed. For days after the interview aired, the country was still vibrating with reactions. News outlets scrambled to analyze what had happened. Some called it the stillness strategy. Others framed it as a masterclass in emotional communication. But away from the headlines and panel discussions, something else had begun to stir, something quieter, and far more real. Letters. Not tweets, not comments. Actual handwritten letters began arriving at the studio, the White House archives, and the Obama Foundation. Thousands. From teachers, teenagers, veterans, single mothers, pastors, and even former critics. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a young woman in New Orleans named Alondra V., aged 19. She wrote, "Mr. President. When I was 12, my school cafeteria broadcasted your inauguration. We were told to clap. Some did. Some didn't. I was confused. But this week, I wasn't. For the first time, I saw a man not trying to convince me, but to remember something inside himself. That made me remember something too, that hope doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be alive." Obama read the letter privately. Then, without alerting the press or scheduling any media, he picked up a pen. He wrote back. Not with policy or pretense, just with honesty. "Dear Alondra. I've spent years trying to live up to the hopes people placed in me, sometimes failing, sometimes holding on. But when I paused the other night, it wasn't to create a moment. It was because I remembered someone like you, watching. I'm honored you saw me. I saw you too." This reply never went viral. It wasn't meant to. But Alondra shared it with her teacher, who shared it with her school principal, who framed it in the main hallway beneath the quote, "Sometimes history is written in the quietest ink." The voice that came after wasn't broadcast, it was whispered from one person to another. Meanwhile, Jonathan Maris was facing the aftermath of the interview in his own way. Invitations poured in, late-night shows, international panels, book deals. But he declined them all. He returned instead to the community center in Queens where he had once interned in college. He delivered a small lecture to a group of teenage journalism students. They expected tips on questioning power. He gave them something else. Ask your questions. But don't forget to ask why you're asking. Because sometimes, the bravest thing a journalist can do, is to shut up and listen. The moment broke him open. And that openness became contagious. Within weeks, several elected officials from both parties referenced the interview, some defensively, others reflectively. One congresswoman from Iowa said in a town hall, "Maybe what we need is less performance, and more pause." Even satirical late-night hosts took a different tone. In one segment, a comedian remarked, "The man went silent and somehow said more than the last 5 debates combined." But none of that mattered as much as what began happening in unexpected places. Pushpin in a juvenile detention center in Michigan, staff played the interview for young inmates. Afterwards, one of them whispered, "He ain't my president. But that man, he understands pain." Pushpin in a rural church in Mississippi, a pastor rewrote his entire sermon around the idea of being heard without shouting. Pushpin in a coffee shop in Seattle, someone anonymously paid for 12 customers' drinks with a note that read, "Pass on the quiet kind of leadership." Obama remained mostly silent. He issued no follow-up statement. He tweeted no quote. His only public appearance was at a literacy event for underprivileged children, where he read from the Velveteen Rabbit. A photographer snapped an image of him sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by kids. That image, without context, became the second most shared photo on the internet that month. And yet, the original moment, the interview, continued echoing in quiet ways. One night, back at the same studio, a janitor cleaning the stage found something taped underneath the table where Obama had sat. It was a note written in Sharpie. Just one line. "They didn't need me to raise my voice. They needed to know I still had one." It wasn't signed. But everyone knew who had written it. That single sentence said what no closing statement ever could. It wasn't the policies, the legacy speeches, the polished farewell tours that people remembered. It was the silence, and the voice that followed. Not because it was perfect. Not because it was presidential. But because, just for a moment, it felt like the country wasn't being spoken to, it was being heard.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that move the world. Thanks for watching.